We've done a lot of crying. It's just, all of it has been just terrible. Just absolute, nothing that anybody could ever imagine.
Welcome to the FITSNews studio for a very special edition of your Week in Review, Voices from Appalachia. Our Andy Fancher and Dylan Nolan traveled to the mountains of western North Carolina this week to bring our audience the latest on the unfolding catastrophe in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. The impact of this storm on western North Carolina, unprecedented. Dylan and Andy are going to talk about where they went, who they spoke with, and Andy's going to break down the true death toll from this disaster and the pushback he's gotten for reporting on it. Dylan and I are also going to sit down and talk about the impact of the storm on voting in western North Carolina. Will it impact this critical swing state, one of 7 battlegrounds ahead of the upcoming 2024 race now, less than 2 weeks away? We're going to go through that, as well as early voting and a host of other issues as the election draws ever closer. All of that and more heading your way on a very special edition of the Week in Review.
We heard it was going to be bad down here. We heard it was going to be looting. We heard it was going to be horrendous stuff, and we didn't know what, but the devastation was amazing. We came through town, and I personally saw somebody hanging in a tree about 20 feet above the ground.
So I'm here with Andy Fancher, who has made 4 trips now up to the mountains of western North Carolina. Andy, where are we now with the recovery?
September 27th, 2024 was the day Appalachia stood still, where thousands of mountaineers were blindsided by a storm the likes of which neither them nor their family have ever seen. We're talking wind speeds topping 100 miles per hour, at least 6 tornadoes, at least 3 fatal mudslides that we can account for, creeks widening some 400 feet, and rivers rising some 26 feet in a matter of minutes. And now, approximately 1 month after that apocalyptic deluge, we're talking S-Class Mercedes wrapped around oak trees, 18-wheelers twisted up like a wet towel, and some 40 miles of commercial railroad dumped into the North Toe River. And that's just what I can account for alone.
So on your trips, let me ask you this, from the first trip to your most recent trip, spanning what, a 3-week period or so thereabouts?
Right.
Is the infrastructure coming back? Is the rebuild getting off the ground? Are we beginning to see Appalachia sort of rise up from that moment of destructive stillness?
Sure. We have seen volunteers, community members, and yes, at this point, federal responders rising not only from the ashes, but from the dust that's being kicked up from the mud blankets that were tossed upon dozens and dozens of towns and hollers. So every time I go up there, I get just an even better understanding of the totality of this storm. When we started, we were hyper-focused on Buncombe County, county seat being Asheville and Swannanoa, resembles that of Baghdad, according to veterans that I've interviewed out that way. But once you start going out to western North Carolina and speaking with first responders, you see, wow, we've got Buncombe, and from Buncombe to Rutherford, from Rutherford to Yancey, from Yancey to Mitchell. It's an unending path of totality. And yes, we're seeing some roads cleared. Every time you go up there, it's just a tiny chunk pulled from this catastrophic disaster. I mean, when I go up there, and occasionally I'll bump into other riders, we find issues with how to exactly describe this storm. You could refer to Katrina coverage, but even then, it doesn't even begin to put into perspective what we're dealing with up there.
Well, let's put it into a little perspective. Obviously, the initial estimates of damage from Hurricane Helene came in at about 115 to 160 billion, which, even if that estimate had stood, that would have been the 3rd or 4th costliest storm ever to hit our country. Since then, however, additional revised estimates have been released with a top-end damage estimate, Andy, of $250 billion, $250 billion, which would be the costliest storm. Now we have to answer the question, in addition to being the costliest, could it also be the deadliest? Before we get to that, before we get to those death toll numbers that have been so controversial,
Of course.
you talked about kind of where you've been in North Carolina on these recent trips. Tell us a little bit about who you've spoken to on those trips.
Sure, and I suppose that would segue into the latest journey where our Director of Special Projects, Dylan Nolan, who's actually, it was his idea to even go to North Carolina in the first place. He joined me, acted as a force multiplier as we interviewed some of the Rolodex that I have built in probing North Carolina these past 3 weeks. You see, mountaineers are certainly, at least the folks I've spoken to, skeptical of media, and who would blame them? So it's been a lot of gaining trust as well as building relationships. I mean, we are talking with a traumatic experience with PTSD lasting decades at this point. I could only imagine. So this particular trip, we went to Mitchell County, one of many areas wholly overlooked and underreported by mainstream media as far as I'm concerned. And there, Dylan and I met with a master carpenter, Trey O'Hara, who I had met in Buckham County, and he had, of course, found his way even further north where the help is needed. At this hour, he's probably restoring generators across Appalachia. He is applying what he knows, this South Carolinian, across the mountains, restoring power, at least where Dylan and I saw, to at least one individual who was 21 days without electricity. And that was in, what was that, Little Switzerland, I believe? So Trey's story is amazing in that he responded the weekend Helene made landfall. And when I first heard his testimony in the parking lot of a church, I was mesmerized. And I knew that we had to sit down at some point. And by God's grace, at the Ledger Volunteer Fire Department, we did. And let's just say that his perspective, his eyewitness account, is alarming, and that it's certainly not something that we've seen mainstream media speak on. So if you don't mind, let's toss to that.
I guess we'll be a conspiracy theorist right up to the point that we're not, you know? And at that point, it's like, why didn't you tell me? Oh, but we did. I mean, before we left town, the other little town that I was in, I know that I came by the fire station there. I looked over, then there's stacks chest high of body bags, 45, maybe even 50 feet long. And so just that alone, that'd be more than what they're reporting right there. I mean, whose ears does it got to hit before somebody decides to do something different? You know, it's gonna be the right set of ears sooner or later. You know, all we gotta do is keep truth telling.
So Andy, he's saying in that clip that just what he's seen exceeds the death toll that mainstream media is continuing to point to, which, by the way, didn't we have an additional 30 resurrections this week? They lowered the death toll even further.
Once again.
Let me ask you this, and obviously that's one testimony, but you've heard from dozens at this point.
I mean, it's a reverberation of what we've heard from first responders, from nonprofits that have since succumbed to backlash from mainstream media for reporting on bodies that they maintain they handled themselves. And Trey's not alone. He actually encouraged us to speak with someone who's been managing his generator assignments, someone who's unofficially the generator girl, Angel Marks, who comes from a background of teaching in North Carolina. Her area was not struck by Helene, at least not from what she could attest to. But we sat down with her at the same volunteer fire department where she maintains that they've distributed generators from as far as Asheville to East Tennessee, another underreported corner of Helene's deluge. And we sat down and spoke on Well, the federal response. I asked her point blank, rate FEMA's response, as she is, of course, a community member and a mountain mover who's been coordinating quite a bit of help across Appalachia. And I'm not going to speak for her. Here's what she had to say. As somebody who's been helping these folks out here, coordinating actual life-saving efforts,
Yes.
rate FEMA's response.
0. 0. They haven't helped. They haven't helped any. I did have somebody come down here and tell me that FEMA said they would give them money for a generator when they found it in their budget. So I asked him, when did they think, did he have a prognosis of when that was going to be, when it was going to be in their budget? They didn't have any clue. This man had medical needs. He had to have breathing machines and different things of that sort. He has heart problems. We installed a generator for him yesterday. I didn't, Trey did.
So, Andy, the folks you're talking to on the ground are obviously countering the official narrative from this storm. And I want to point one thing out as we cover this. We've said from the beginning that the reporting that we've been doing, the death toll estimates that we've been providing, they are not our numbers. This is what folks on the ground who have witnessed this catastrophe have told us they saw with their own eyes. And you have even showed me some pictures this week of stuff I couldn't imagine seeing. And the bodies in the body bags. The proof is there. Let me ask you this. What is the holdup? Because you've shown me, we've seen lists with names. And you can see, as you pointed out, the same names, the families that have been destroyed by this. Why is the truth not coming out, in your estimation?
That's a question I pose to a lot of folks out there. You see, when you're traveling up to haulers on side-by-sides and hearing firsthand accounts of people losing everything, including their families, don't think these first responders don't have time to really mull over why this isn't being reported as well. And I ask them that, and it just, you can't help but pause and wonder why. I wish I could answer the question you just posed to me, and I'm sure they would too. It just, in our reporting alone, in our probing of Appalachia alone, we've been provided the list to over 100 fatalities, and understand that at the time of this recording, the official count is 95.
Let's talk a little bit about some of the pushback that you've gotten. There was a big report from a South Carolina station in the upstate. Didn't name us, but it was taking direct aim at you, at your reporting. There's another report out of a Charleston station which referred to some of the disinformation as Russian bots. Obviously, you're not a Russian bot. Dylan's not a Russian bot. I may be a Russian bot. We don't know yet. But
okay.
Let's ask the big question here. Why is there such an organized effort to attack your reporting?
It makes you wonder. And again, those are the hypotheticals that I wish I had the answers to. And while I don't have the answers to the why, we have receipts. Where mainstream media pushes back and calls at least one of my Facebook posts, which they describe to a T, as misinformation or untrue. Yeah. We've got the evidence. Yeah. They wanted to push back on our overstating, or I forgot what the exact word they used, of body bags alone that were handled by the West Carolina Emergency Network. We were provided photographs, pallets and pallets of boxes of body bags that were requested by first responders and nonprofits alike. But it's untrue if you ask that mainstream affiliate in Greenville, South Carolina. And, additional pushback and some of the rhetoric that we're hearing throughout national headlines is we can't report on the fatalities or the unidentified, right? Well, I call BS on that as someone who used to work for an NBC affiliate myself. In fact, somebody who used to work for the parent company that put out the hit piece on us. I have stood at the street corner reporting on somebody who was shot, whose identity was not yet known yet. So if we can do that at the local level on some flyover tragedy, then there is no reason we can't talk about the hundreds upon hundreds that are dead, or, according to some first responders, thousands. At this time, we've still got thousands unaccounted for, according to first responders, buddied with a very exhaustive Google Doc that's being updated as we speak. At this time, there are still hollers and entire communities unaccounted for. Hell, and Dylan and I's latest trip up there, they just reached another family. And that's 25 days, nearly 4 weeks after this thing barreled through. And the stories are just horrendous. A 90-plus-year-old living that duration of time on a can of beans. A family man holding his wife's hand as the roaring rapids came barreling through the mountains, letting go of her hand to try and rescue his son, watching them both wash away into the abyss. Telling first responders he wished he'd had died too. And who is MSM to say that didn't happen? Because that's what they're doing.
Yeah. I want to close on a note that I think whatever you think the death toll here is, whatever your number is, I think everyone can relate to this. And it was a story that you did earlier this week. You've done a ton of reporting from Western North Carolina, but this was a story about folks helping. And it was in response actually to a plea that you made on this show last week. Hey, if you can help, let me know. Mm-hmm. And people responded, didn't they? Walk us through some of
to an overwhelming degree, man. I encouraged anyone displaced by the storm to reach out, and that prompted folks from as far as Oregon to email me directly at andy@fitsnews.com for pleading with ways to help. I mean, some of the email headlines were, "We're here, where do we go?" All right, I am elated to see our reporting resonate with so many people to the point that they want to send anything and everything they've got. You know, we have an individual in Florida offering a vacation cottage right now to someone displaced. And all of that is being actively updated as more emails come in under a headline, "We Can Help, Service Offerings to North Carolina." So that is a live feed article, including contact information, whether it be email or phone number, for folks who, upon clearing and contact with me, asked to be published so that they can get patched through to somebody who needs help. And that'll once again be my plea on this recording here. If you've got the ways, means, and ability to offer something, hit me up again, andy@fitsnews.com. We'll throw you in the live feed article, because let me tell you, Will, Appalachia is bleeding. And while mountaineers might not say they need help, as we've heard from volunteers, you kind of got to twist their arm. There is no asking, "Hey, what can we get for you?" It's, "Hey, take this because you need it." I mean, we're talking frigid temperatures come sundown. I mean, I can attest to it as somebody who camped in the mountains with Marines last week. I mean, that is fatal cold, man. There are 2 hypothermic deaths that we can attest to, of 2 children who survived the storm only to die in the temperatures ensuing it. So yeah, Appalachia needs help. And if MSM won't talk about it, then alternative media will.
Well, Andy, keep doing your part to help by telling the truth of how serious it is and what others who can and do have the means to do, how they can help.
Now, in addition to the live feed articles that we have up and available now, I have received several emails from folks stating that they still have family members or friends that remain unreachable following this storm. So at this time, I'm efforting almost a "have you seen me"-esque report. So if there are folks in the ether who want to put their friends or families or relatives in this live feed article as well, just know that channel, my line is always open. Again, andy@fitsnews.com. Reach out to me. I will do my damnedest to get back with you and put your story out.
So we're keeping our focus in Western North Carolina as we begin our political segment. I'm joined by Dylan Nolan. Dylan, you joined Andy up in Western North Carolina. You saw everything he saw. Walk us through a little bit about the rumors we've been hearing about the electoral infrastructure there, about how the decimation from Hurricane Helene could potentially impact the ability of people in Western North Carolina to vote, and therefore potentially the 2024 election via North Carolina's status as a swing state. What did you see up there with Andy?
Yeah, so first of all, my mission in going up there with Andrew this week was to help him tell the stories that he's been collecting over the last couple of weeks. He's been doing great work there, boots on the ground, and he's gotten some of these folks with whom he's developed relationships to the point where they wanted to go on camera and share their stories. And so I went up there to support him in doing that. But I had a secondary mission, which, works in line with my reporting over the course of multiple months on the potential of North Carolina and Georgia to be swing states, to assess how this storm might impact voting in North Carolina. And I can tell you from the folks that we spoke to, there's a strong inclination to vote Trump. And obviously this is not surprising given the fact that this area voted heavily for Trump in previous elections and is populated by conservatives. But the interesting thing is that I spoke with multiple people who all that's left of their home is a foundation, who are living in tents. I mean, I spoke to a man who the only thing he had left in the world was an Easy Up tent with some cans of butane, which he was going to use to keep warm that night, underneath it. And in front of his Easy Up is a Trump sign. And I said, is that your sign, sir? And he says, no, I'm not sure who put it there, but I like it, And just 30 feet away from this gentleman, as I'm having this conversation, I look and I see somebody distributing food in styrofoam containers, wearing a Trump shirt. And I spoke to some of the individuals with whom he was distributing the food, or to whom rather, some of the locals, and they were expressing their support for Donald Trump. So it's clear that these people are politically charged. They're thinking about this election. And so my question to these folks who are, destitute at a biblical level of destitution here, do you have a way to make it to the polls? And, some of the folks who Andy's been corresponding with, like just this week, got a bicycle from people nicely donating. But these are folks who may very well still have no mode of transportation because a lot of folks' cars are completely disabled. So I think it's incumbent upon the GOP to put together a get out the vote operation where, and I think that this is something that can happen organically from people in the community who still have access to transportation, but it's incumbent upon operatives in North Carolina to ensure that these people who want to vote, but who might not have a way to get to the polls, can get there. And the second part of this is polls are open. The government is done a good job there in reopening polling locations, even in places where, 20% of the homes still don't have power, where people are still struggling to stay warm at night. There are polling locations open. There are campaign signs out. Politics as usual. This election has not gone away. And it seems as though the state is facilitating people's ability to vote. It just comes down to these people actually getting to the polls.
So the electoral infrastructure in Western North Carolina is there. It's intact. It's just a question of people with, again, widespread vehicular carnage up there. It's just a question of them being able to get there. It sounds almost like a job opportunity for Elon Musk. You've given him Starlink, Mr. Musk, and maybe get some EVs there to do a GoTV campaign. Dylan, let me ask you this question in Western North Carolina. Based on what you've seen, what you know, folks you've spoken to, is there the potential for this, whatever it is, whether it's an infrastructure issue or a transportation issue, is there the potential for what's happening in Western North Carolina to swing the state of North Carolina away from Donald Trump and to Kamala Harris?
So I obviously was only there for 48 hours. I saw what I saw. I do believe that I saw a representative sample of folks' sentiment. However, what I saw does not give you any statistical analytical abilities as far as whether this will swing the state. However, there are folks who are a lot smarter than I am, a lot more sophisticated than I am, who have the ability to run those numbers, and they've said that they don't believe that this will be sufficient to swing the state. Now, even their advanced mathematical models, I think there are variables here which nobody can accurately predict. However, I can say that the intangible thing that's the hardest to predict, which is whether these people are thinking about voting, I can tell you that's certainly on their minds.
Indeed. And why would it not be based on what's gone on there and the federal response or lack thereof, as Andy was talking about earlier? Let's look to other battleground states, Dylan. Obviously, North Carolina, one of 7 states that most folks have been focused on in the run-up to this election. There may be more battleground states. We'll have to see. As some folks looking at polling in New Hampshire, Virginia, Minnesota, some other places, starting to see some trends that are interesting. But I wanted to look at some numbers. We're looking at Real Clear Polling's rolling averages. They do a really good job of incorporating a ton of different polls
From the left, from the right.
all over the place. And they produce these sort of rolling averages. They change every day. But as we go into the weekend, Georgia, Trump is up 2.2 according to those rolling averages. That's approaching the margin of error there, getting out of the margin of error. Arizona up 1.5, North Carolina up 0.8, Nevada 0.7, Pennsylvania 0.6, Michigan and Wisconsin each 0.2%. And by the way, there were a few Bloomberg and Quinnipiac polls there at the very end that kind of tilted a few of those numbers back toward Kamala. But Trump ahead in each one of those swing states. And if you go back, same day, 4 years ago, Biden was leading in every single one of those swing states by margins ranging from over 2 points to, in one state, Michigan, I believe it was 9 points. This is a huge shift.
And it should be noted that those states which delivered him victory, which he was polling well ahead in, he won like most of these by less than 1 point. They were nail biters. So to your point, if the polls are accurate, Trump will win. If there's a polling error this election cycle, he will most definitely win.
Well, I want to ask you about that polling error, but first, I want to ask you why you think we've seen this shift. What is driving the shift? Is it something Trump's doing, or is it something Kamala Harris isn't doing? What are your thoughts on that?
I think that Trump is certainly, he's retail politicking very well. I think that dispassionate analysis from the left or the right would admit that something like Trump's visit to McDonald's, where he's pumping hands and kissing babies, so to speak, he's really good at that. He's a really good retail campaigner.
Salting fries.
Yes, salting fries and delivering them through the drive-through window.
Fixing the milkshake machine, according to the big meme.
Well, if he fixes the McDonald's milkshake machine, he'll be president for more than just one term. I mean, that would be monumental. But in all seriousness, I think he's executing what he needs to execute on the campaign trail. And Harris has been running a media blitz. We referenced this media blitz. We referenced the fact that it was ineffective last week. And I think that, unfortunately for her, it's continued to be ineffective into this week.
What's an example?
She had a town hall on CNN, which should be a layup for any Democrat presidential candidate. And yet she ended up not answering the questions which she had struggled with answering last week on, once again, programs which should have been softballs like The View. She was asked the same questions. She was given another swing at them, and she still did not have cogent answers for them. And she actually ended the program by getting grilled by Anderson Cooper. If you're running for president as a Democrat and 2 weeks away from the election, you're trying to shore up the black vote and getting grilled by Anderson Cooper on CNN, that is on multiple fronts not a sign that things are going well.
Well, and he was hitting her hard, too. I mean, calling her out on the border wall, pointing out how she criticized the construction of the wall more than 50 times, calling it stupid. And now she embraces it. Now, let me ask you this. With her, is it more of the flip-flopping, or is it the inability to articulate? Is it these word melanges, as our Mark Powell calls them? What do you think's hurting her more? Is it just the incompetence or the flip-flopping?
I mean, I think her as a candidate, the flip-flopping, her inability to speak cogently is certainly a problem. But the other problem is that I don't think she's been able to sell the idea that she's going to be any different than Joe Biden. And people don't like the results of this administration, if you believe the polls. I mean, that's the reason that Joe Biden was removed, not because he's senile. I mean, he's clearly mentally well enough to remain being president, but he was too senile to have any chance of winning election. And if she were smart, she would have differentiated herself and her policies from what's happening right now. But I think folks can look at the economic realities of what life was like under the Trump administration and the economic realities of trying to afford things like food or trying to afford a new home right now. And unless she is able to differentiate herself from that, which at this point, it's getting to be too late in the game to even do that, she's going to have a hard time come election night.
Let's go back to that hidden Trump vote that we were just talking about earlier. You were referencing it in relation to this shift that we've seen in the polls, and you also did a great job of pointing out how those poll numbers we were talking about, Biden up on Trump in the last election in so many of these states by big margins, yet only prevailing, ostensibly, by very narrow margins. Tell us a little bit about the hidden Trump vote. How do you see it unfolding in 2024 versus the last two elections? Clearly, it was there in 2016 and 2020. Do you think it'll be there again in 2024?
So on previous episodes, when discussing this topic, we discussed the fact that it's difficult to poll Trump voters because a lot of them are not folks who regularly vote in elections. So they're not the folks who are necessarily first on the Rolodex of these pollsters to call. Another problem, that we saw in 2016 was that people were reluctant to say that they support Trump just because of the social stigma. But I think that there's a new element, and you actually spoke to a national pollster who has a reputation of quite accurately predicting presidential elections, who said that the respondents to their polls are asking, like, where's this information going, and almost sounding fearful. And I think when you're in an environment where political allies of Trump are quite literally being prosecuted, I mean, dozens of people are in federal prison right now who are connected with Trump in some way. I think that that is actually going to skew poll numbers more than anyone can predict right now. I mean, we'll see after Election Day what the results end up looking like, but I can certainly understand not wanting to put yourself down on any sort of written list as a Trump supporter if you're concerned about that type of thing.
Well, Dylan, a lot of Trump voters don't even get to that point in the call. They hang up the phone the second they hear I'm a pollster with so-and-so. But looking past the battleground states, let's talk about something that's a phenomenon all across the country this cycle, early voting. And we pulled some numbers here in South Carolina. This is the first year early voting has really been in effect. We saw it in the presidential primary back in February. Republicans, ton of them turned out for early voting. We saw a little bit of early voting in the partisan primaries back in June, but it has exploded ahead of the general election through 4 days, first 4 days of early voting here in South Carolina. More than 500,000 people, 511,000 people have banked their ballots. Dylan, that is 20% of the vote from last election, 15% of the 3.4 million registered voters here in South Carolina. And we're only 4 days into early voting. We got 8 more days of early voting left, then Election Day. Across the country, we're looking at 34 million votes already cast in this election. In the swing states, outside the swing states, we got a little bit of indicators on the partisan. We've got 7 million Democrats casting ballots early, 6.1 million Republicans, 4 million undecided or unaffiliated rather. But those are just in the states where they track the partisan ID. Dylan, it's obviously a surge in early voting. Who does it benefit in your estimation?
Let's look back to 2020 to answer this question, because COVID was used by many of these Democrat governors in swing states, let's look at Pennsylvania, as a reason to go in and, honestly, through questionable legal processes, change how early voting was done. And this was something that the Trump campaign looked at as stealing the election. I think it's something that drove his big claims of the election being stolen after the fact, but it meant that during the campaign, he was speaking out against early voting and encouraging his supporters not to vote early. And everybody remembers the election return graphs on election night where, Trump was here, Biden was here, and then in the middle of the night, boom, that was when the early votes got counted. And it became clear to every strategic Republican operative that this is not a winning strategy. And so Republicans this election cycle have done a complete 180 and are now encouraging their supporters to vote early, and it's clear that a lot of them are. I mean, I think that one particular area which has a partisan return that is very interesting is Miami-Dade. This is a county that is typically not one that Republicans do great in, which is now more than 10 points in Trump's favor on early vote returns.
Unbelievable. Trump himself obviously now supporting early voting, calling on his supporters to go ahead and bank their ballots, which, again, a radical departure from last go-round. Dylan, we talked earlier about the state of play, about Trump's forward momentum in the battleground states, about the potential for an even bigger margin for him, depending on how big this hidden Trump vote is this cycle, if it's still there. By the way, I agree with you. I think it is there. And I think the logic that our pollster friend, who, by the way, we may hear from that pollster this coming week, we'll see. But I think that makes sense. I mean, fear is a more powerful motivator to me than shame or embarrassment. So if I got a pollster calling me and it's one of those two
Shame
things.
is one thing. Federal prison is another.
Right. But when you look at these trends, and obviously the markets are pricing in a Trump victory. I mean, that much is clear. And now we're not talking about predict it and poly market anymore. We're talking about
The
Wall
bond
Street.
market.
Yeah.
Yes.
Wall Street is fully on board with a Trump victory. Is it going to be too big to steal if these trends that we're following end up panning out? And again, we're not saying they will. This could go either way. But assuming that hidden Trump vote is where it was in previous cycles and these polls are correct, and that would mean Trump wins, is it going to be too big to rig?
That's interesting. We've seen narratives seeded in multiple swing states. You look at Maricopa County in Arizona, which is where the majority of the residents of that state live. They've said that their results will take as long as 13 days to come out. Similar narratives coming out in Pennsylvania, which is the keystone state to this election. Whoever wins Pennsylvania has a clear path to victory. Whoever loses Pennsylvania has a very narrow path to victory. And I don't think it's accidental that these narratives are being seeded. That being said, even if these states can't get their acts together and count votes in a reasonable amount of time, every media outlet in the country wants to be the first one to call the race. So they're all going to be putting exit polls, exit pollsters, and as many of these swing state crucial counties as possible so that they can hopefully get accurate data even before the states release their data as to how folks are voting. So I think that we will have an idea on election night, even if we don't have official totals from all of these states, if these polls hold up and Trump carries the margin which it is predicted he will carry.
Indeed. And you had mentioned those early voting states. Speaking to large delays, Georgia, by contrast, their officials have indicated that they plan on reporting that early vote on election night, and that as much as perhaps 70% of the vote in Georgia could be available for us to review at 7 p.m. On election night, which would be amazing. That would certainly give us some clarity on where the race is headed, wouldn't it?
It certainly would. I mean, that already, if returns come in well for Trump in Georgia, that starts closing a door for Harris that will be hard to get back open.
Indeed. Well, we've got a big election night planned too. You want to give a little promo as we head out of this segment?
So we're going to be doing an election night live stream. You can watch it on YouTube. You can watch it on our X page. And we are lining up some really good guests. And I'm not overhyping this. I'm really excited. We're not going to drop exactly who's coming in the studio right now. But let me tell you, these are some folks who know what they're talking about in politics and who are also just really entertaining, interesting people. So it's going to be a really fun night. We're going to come on shortly before the polls close at 7 p.m. Eastern. And we're going to broadcast for a long time. We don't have a set cutoff time, but we're going to be on the air for a long time. And we'd love to have you all here with us. Enjoy the election coverage and enjoy something that's going to be, I think, more interesting than the mainstream media offering. So we're putting together something really special, really fun, and we're going to have the individuals here so that it's also going to be really insightful.
So catch us on election night, folks, as we continue to parse the polls and bring you the very latest on the 2024 presidential race. All right, folks, that is a wrap for a very special edition of Your Week in Review. I want to thank everybody for tuning in. I especially want to thank those who subscribe to FITSNews.com. It's only $8 a month, but those subscriptions empower everything we do here. Speaking truth to power, holding folks accountable. Next week, the Month in Review. We do this live, without a net, no margin for error. So be sure to check that out as we bring you all the latest stories that we've covered over the past month. Also, I want to shout out to Victoria's Verdict. Victoria Smith Legal down in the Charleston region of South Carolina. You get in an auto accident down there and need a lawyer for any reason, she's your call, folks. Victoria's Verdict, call Victoria Smith Legal. We will catch you next time on The Week in Review.